The bar smelled like old wood and cheap whiskey, the kind of working-class place where no one asks questions, where no one cares who you are. She sat in the corner, a silk dress clinging tight to her body, unaware that even without a name tag, she still stood out like a sore thumb, completely wrong for a place like this. Catherine Monroe, the woman whose face graced magazine covers, whose signature moved millions, was falling apart in designer heels and smudged mascara, surrounded by strangers who didn't know her name. Until someone did, probably some employee from a cheap tabloid, shouting her name with glee. The flash from a phone camera sliced through the darkness like a knife, and suddenly, she wasn't a person anymore, just a headline waiting to explode tomorrow morning. Her eyes darted around in panic, desperate, then landed on a man with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if he would help. But she whispered anyway, her voice trembling. "Please, get me out of here. Fast." And without a word, he stood up, peeled off his worn denim jacket, and stepped between her and the world that wanted to devour her. Daniel Hayes hadn't planned on being anyone's hero that night. He'd only stopped by the Blue Corner because it was Friday, because his shift at Burton's Auto Repair had run 2 hours late, and because he needed exactly 1 beer before heading home to his 8-year-old daughter. Sophie would be asleep by now, tucked in by Mrs. Patterson from next door, the same neighbor who'd been watching her 3 nights a week for the past 2 years since Daniel's ex-wife left them both for a real estate agent in Phoenix. The beer was cold, the bar was quiet, and for 20 minutes, Daniel had let himself just exist without worrying about oil changes or overdue electric bills or whether Sophie's shoes would last another month. Then the woman in the corner had caught his attention, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she looked like she was drowning in plain sight. Her hands shook every time she lifted her glass. Her eyes kept scanning the room like she was waiting for something terrible to happen. Daniel had seen that look before, on his own face in the mirror during the worst months after the divorce, and it made something in his chest tighten with recognition. He'd gone back to his beer, telling himself it wasn't his business, that he had enough problems without taking on a stranger's pain. But then the man with the camera phone had started shouting, and the woman's face had gone white with terror, and Daniel had stopped thinking entirely. His body had moved on instinct, the same instinct that made him check on Sophie 3 times every night, that made him work double shifts so she could have new books and art supplies. That made him the kind of man his daughter could be proud of. He'd grabbed his jacket, crossed the bar in 4 long strides, and wrapped the worn denim around the woman's shoulders before she could say another word. The fabric smelled like motor oil and laundry detergent, nothing like the expensive perfume that clung to her skin, but it covered her face and her panic. And that was all that mattered. "She's with me," Daniel said, his voice low and firm, the tone he used when Sophie's teacher called about bullies. "Back off." The photographer, a wiry guy in his 30s with a press badge hanging crooked around his neck, hesitated for just a second, long enough for Daniel to guide the woman toward the back exit. She stumbled in her heels, and he caught her elbow, steadying her without thinking about how her skin felt warm under his calloused palm. The bar erupted in whispers behind them, phones coming out, more flashes lighting up the dim space. But Daniel kept moving, one hand on her back, the other pushing open the door to the alley. The night air hit them cold and sharp, carrying the smell of rain and garbage bins. The woman sagged against the brick wall, her breathing ragged, mascara tracking down her cheeks in dark rivers. Daniel stood in front of her, blocking the door with his body, his mind racing to figure out what came next. He didn't know who she was, not really, though the name Catherine Monroe tickled something in his memory, maybe from newspapers he'd glanced at in the waiting room at Sophie's dentist. He didn't know what she'd done to deserve that kind of attention, or why she'd been alone in a dive bar looking like she wanted to disappear. What he did know was that she was terrified, and that going back inside wasn't an option. "My truck's around the corner," Daniel said quietly, not looking at her directly, giving her space to breathe. "I can give you a ride somewhere safe, or I can call someone for you, whatever you need." The woman looked up at him, her eyes glassy with alcohol and fear. And for a long moment she didn't say anything. Then she shook her head, a small, jerky motion that made her hair fall across her face. "I can't go home," she whispered, her voice so soft he had to lean in to hear it. "They'll be there, the photographers. They're always there." Daniel glanced back at the door, where he could hear raised voices and the scrape of chairs. Someone would come looking soon, probably the guy with the camera, probably others who'd caught wind of whatever story was unfolding here. He made a decision without weighing it too carefully, the kind of decision that felt right in his gut, even if it might be stupid everywhere else. "Okay," he said, meeting her eyes. "Then you'll come with me, just for tonight, until you figure out your next move." She stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Like kindness was something she couldn't quite translate. Then, slowly, she nodded. Daniel led her to his pickup truck, a battered Ford that had seen better decades, and helped her into the passenger seat. She curled up small against the door, his jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, and didn't say another word as he drove through the empty streets toward the small apartment he shared with Sophie. The radio played low, some country song about second chances, and Daniel tried not to think about what he was doing, bringing a stranger home, a stranger who was clearly in some kind of trouble. He tried not to think about how Mrs. Patterson would react, or what Sophie would say in the morning, or how his simple, careful life had just gotten a whole lot more complicated when they pulled up outside his building, a 3-story walk-up in a neighborhood that was safe enough but wouldn't make anyone's travel guide. Catherine finally spoke again. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice steadier now, more curious than afraid. Daniel turned off the engine and looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the expensive dress and the smudged makeup to the exhaustion underneath, the kind that went bone deep. "Because someone should," he said simply. "And because I want my daughter to grow up in a world where people do the right thing, even when it's inconvenient." Something flickered across Catherine's face then, something that might have been surprise or gratitude or disbelief. She didn't argue, just let him help her out of the truck and up the stairs to his second-floor apartment. Mrs. Patterson was reading on the couch when they walked in, and her eyebrows shot up so fast they nearly hit her hairline. Daniel gave her a quick, apologetic smile and an explanation that was mostly true about a friend who needed a safe place to crash. Mrs. Patterson, bless her, was the kind of woman who'd raised 5 kids and didn't ask questions she didn't need answers to. She gathered her knitting, patted Daniel on the arm, and left without commenting on the designer heels or the red-rimmed eyes. The door clicked shut behind her, and the apartment fell into silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. Daniel cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how small his home must look to someone like Catherine Monroe. The furniture was secondhand, the carpet worn thin in spots, the walls decorated with Sophie's crayon drawings, and a calendar from the auto shop. It was clean, at least. He kept it that way, but it wasn't much. "You can take the couch," he said, grabbing a blanket from the hall closet and a pillow from his own bed. "Bathroom's down the hall. I'll get you some water and aspirin. You're probably going to need it in the morning." He moved through the motions automatically, filling a glass, shaking out 2 pills, setting them on the coffee table next to the couch. Catherine stood in the middle of the living room like she didn't know what to do with herself, her arms wrapped around her body, his jacket hanging loose around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said finally, the words coming out rough and sincere. "I mean it. Thank you." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to say anything that wouldn't sound stupid or patronizing. He showed her where the extra toothbrush was, made sure she had everything she needed, and then retreated to his bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. He could hear her moving around in the living room, the creak of the couch springs, the sound of water running in the bathroom. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell he'd just gotten himself into, wondering if she'd be gone in the morning, wondering if he'd done the right thing or just made everything worse. Sleep didn't come easy, but eventually exhaustion won out, and he drifted off to the sound of rain starting to fall against the windows. The smell of coffee woke him 6 hours later. Daniel opened his eyes to sunlight filtering through the cheap blinds and the unmistakable sound of someone moving around in his kitchen. For a disorienting second, he thought maybe Mrs. Patterson had come back early. But then he remembered, and his heart did a weird little skip. He pulled on a clean shirt and jeans and walked out to find Catherine standing at his stove, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, still wearing yesterday's dress but with his jacket draped over the back of a chair. She'd washed her face, he noticed, the mascara gone, leaving her looking younger and more vulnerable than she had in the bar. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing at the coffee pot. "I needed something to do with my hands." Daniel shook his head, crossing to the cupboard to pull down 2 mugs. "It's fine. I usually make a pot around this time anyway, before Sophie wakes up." As if on cue, a small voice called out from the bedroom down the hall. "Dad? Are you making pancakes?" Daniel smiled despite himself. The same smile he always got when he heard his daughter's voice, the one that made everything else feel less heavy. "Not yet, kiddo. Give me 5 minutes." Sophie appeared in the doorway a moment later, her blonde hair sticking up in a dozen directions, her pajamas covered in stars. She stopped short when she saw Catherine, her eyes going wide. For a second, no one moved, and Daniel felt his chest tighten with worry about how to explain this, how to make it make sense. But then Sophie's face broke into a huge grin, the kind that showed all her missing teeth. "Dad," she said, her voice full of wonder. "She looks like a princess." Catherine let out a surprised laugh, the sound a little watery but genuine, and Daniel felt something in his chest ease just slightly. "Sophie, don't be rude," he said automatically, but he was smiling too. "This is Catherine. She's a friend who needed a place to stay last night." Sophie walked right up to Catherine. No fear, no hesitation, just pure 8-year-old curiosity. "Are you okay?" she asked, tilting her head. "You look kind of sad." Catherine crouched down so she was eye level with Sophie, and Daniel saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "I'm okay now," she said softly. "Your dad helped me when I really needed it. He's a very good person." Sophie nodded seriously, like this was obvious information. "He's the best dad in the whole world," she declared. "He works really hard, and he always reads me bedtime stories, even when he's tired. And he makes the best pancakes." Catherine's smile turned genuine then, reaching her eyes. "Well then," she said, "I hope I get to try these famous pancakes." Daniel felt his face warm. Not used to being talked about like this, not used to being seen as anything more than a mechanic who showed up on time and kept his head down. He cleared his throat and moved toward the kitchen, pulling out the pancake mix in the griddle, letting the familiar routine ground him. They ate breakfast together, the 3 of them crowded around Daniel's small kitchen table, and it was strange and oddly comfortable at the same time. Sophie chattered about her school project and her best friend Mia and the book she was reading, barely stopping to breathe between bites. Catherine listened with what looked like genuine interest, asking questions, laughing at Sophie's jokes, relaxing in increments that Daniel could track across her shoulders and her hands. It was only when Sophie went to brush her teeth that Catherine's phone, which she'd left on the counter, started buzzing nonstop. She picked it up and her face went pale again, all the ease draining out of her in an instant. "What is it?" Daniel asked, though he had a feeling he knew. Catherine turned the screen toward him, and he saw headlines scrolling past, photos from last night, grainy and dark, but unmistakable. CEO Monroe loses control at local bar, one read. Billionaire caught drinking alone, said another. The worst one, from a tabloid he vaguely recognized, screamed, Monroe's breakdown. Is the pressure too much? Catherine's hand was shaking again, just like it had been last night, and her breathing had gone shallow and fast. They're calling for an emergency board meeting, she said, her voice hollow. My assistant's been trying to reach me all night. The shareholders are panicking. They think I'm unstable. She laughed, a bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am. Daniel reached out and took the phone from her hand, setting it face down on the table. Hey, he said, waiting until she looked at him. You're not unstable. You're human. There's a difference. Catherine shook her head, tears spilling over despite her obvious effort to hold them back. You don't understand. I can't be human, not in my position. I have to be perfect, always, or they'll tear me apart. The board, the media, the competitors waiting for me to fail. My own father built this company from nothing, and everyone's just waiting for me to prove I can't handle it. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Daniel felt something twist in his chest, recognizing that particular flavor of pain. The fear of not being enough, of letting everyone down. What do you need to do? He asked practically. Because that's what you did when panic set in. You broke it down into steps. Catherine wiped at her eyes, smearing what was left of her makeup. I need to go back, face them, explain somehow. Try to salvage whatever's left of my credibility. She looked at him, her eyes red but determined. Can you drive me to my office? I know it's asking a lot, but I don't trust calling a car right now. Not with photographers probably camped outside my building. Daniel didn't hesitate. Of course. Let me just get Sophie set up with Mrs. Patterson for the day. 20 minutes later, they were back in his truck, Catherine wearing his spare hoodie over her dress because it was the closest thing he had to help her blend in. The drive across town was quiet, the morning traffic thick and slow, giving Daniel too much time to think about what happened next, about how this woman would walk back into her world and he'd go back to his, and that would be that. But then Catherine spoke, her voice softer than before. Why did you help me last night? She asked again, like she still couldn't quite believe it. You didn't know me. You had no reason to get involved. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his hand steady on the wheel. I told you, because it was the right thing to do. He paused, then added, and because I know what it's like to feel alone in a room full of people. After my ex left, I spent months feeling like I was drowning, like everyone was watching me fail and no one was going to throw me a line. A few people did, though. Mrs. Patterson, my boss at the shop, Sophie's teacher. They didn't have to, but they showed up anyway. So when I see someone who needs help, I try to be that person. For Sophie, mostly. I want her to understand. That's how the world should work. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and when Daniel risked a glance over, he saw she was crying again, but silently this time, tears just sliding down her face unchecked. I'm sorry, she said. I'm not usually like this. I don't fall apart. I don't need rescuing. Daniel shook his head. Everyone needs rescuing sometimes. Doesn't make you weak, makes you alive. They pulled up outside Monroe Technologies, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that made Daniel's apartment building look even shabbier by comparison. The parking lot was indeed crawling with reporters, vans with satellite dishes, cameras on tripods. Catherine took a shaky breath, straightening her shoulders like she was putting on armor. Thank you, Daniel, she said, meeting his eyes. I mean it. For everything. She pulled off his hoodie and handed it back, then reached for the door handle. Daniel watched her go, watched her walk through that crowd with her head high, ignoring the shouted questions and the flashing lights, and he felt something like pride mixed with worry. He waited until she was inside the building before driving away, heading back to his side of town, back to his regular life. But something had shifted. He could feel it, like a gear clicking into place. He couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd looked at breakfast, almost peaceful, or the way Sophie had made her laugh, or the loneliness he'd seen underneath all that polish and power. The next few days passed in a strange blur. Daniel went back to work, picked Sophie up from school, made dinner, helped with homework, all the usual rhythms. But he found himself checking his phone more often, scrolling through news sites he never usually read, looking for updates about Catherine Monroe. The stories were everywhere, dissecting her every move, her company's stock prices, the board meeting that had apparently lasted 8 hours. Some outlets were sympathetic, calling her a victim of impossible standards. Others were vicious, suggesting she was cracking under pressure, unsuited for leadership. Daniel hated all of it, the way they talked about her, like she wasn't a real person, like she was just a character in a story they got to write. On the 4th day, a black car pulled up outside his building just as he was getting home from work. Daniel froze on the sidewalk, his toolbox heavy in his hand, watching as the back door opened and Catherine stepped out. She looked different than she had that morning in his kitchen, back in her armor now, a tailored suit and heels, her hair perfect, her makeup flawless. But her eyes were the same, tired and searching, and when she saw him, they lit up with something that made his heart skip. "Hi," she said, walking toward him. "I hope it's okay that I came by. I wanted to thank you properly." Daniel set down his toolbox, suddenly aware of the grease on his hands and the sweat on his shirt. "You already thanked me. You didn't need to come all the way out here." Catherine smiled, a real one this time, not the polished version he'd seen in photos online. "Actually, I did, because you were right, about all of it. I went to that board meeting, and I told them the truth, that I was exhausted and overwhelmed, and that I'd gone to that bar because I needed to feel like a normal person for 5 minutes, that I was tired of pretending to be perfect when perfect doesn't exist." "How'd that go?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. Catherine laughed, the sound easier than it had been before. "Better than I expected. Some of them wanted me out, of course, but others actually listened. My COO, who I thought hated me, stood up and said she'd been feeling the same pressure, that maybe the problem wasn't me, but the impossible standards we set. Long story short, the board voted to keep me on, with the condition that we implement better mental health support for all executives. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Daniel felt himself smile, relief washing through him. "That's good. Really good." They stood there for a moment, neither quite sure what to say next. Then Catherine glanced toward the building. "Is Sophie home? I brought her something. A thank you for sharing her pancakes." She held up a bag Daniel hadn't noticed, and his heart did that weird skip again. "Yeah, she's with Mrs. Patterson. Come on up." He led her inside, hyper-aware of the peeling paint and the flickering hallway light, things he never usually noticed, but that felt glaring now. But Catherine didn't seem to care, just followed him up the stairs and waited while he unlocked the door. Sophie's squeal of delight when she saw Catherine made them both laugh. "You came back!" Sophie yelled, launching herself at Catherine with no regard for the expensive suit. Catherine caught her, hugging back just as tight, and Daniel saw her eyes go shiny again. "I couldn't leave without saying goodbye properly," Catherine said, pulling back to hand Sophie the bag. Inside was a set of art supplies that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly grocery budget, fancy markers and sketchbooks and paints. Sophie's eyes went huge, and she looked at Daniel for permission before tearing into them. "You didn't have to do this," Daniel said quietly, but Catherine shook her head. "I wanted to. She was kind to me when she had no reason to be, just like her dad." They watched Sophie spread out her new supplies on the living room floor, already planning what she'd draw first. Mrs. Patterson appeared from the bedroom, took one look at the scene, and excused herself with a knowing smile that made Daniel's face warm. Catherine turned to him, suddenly serious. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel nodded, bracing himself. "You said you wanted Sophie to grow up in a world where people do the right thing. What if I told you I wanted to help make that world, not just with words, but with real action?" Daniel frowned, not quite following. Catherine pulled out her phone, opening a document and showing it to him. Monroe Technologies is starting a new initiative, a fund to support single parents in crisis, with resources for childcare, job training, emergency housing, all of it. I'm calling it Second Chances. She looked at him, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with alcohol or panic. "I want you to help me run it. Not full-time, I know you have Sophie in your job, but as an advisor. Someone who actually knows what it's like, who can help make sure we're doing it right." Daniel stared at her, his mind racing. "Catherine, I'm a mechanic. I don't know anything about running a charity or whatever this is." "You know what it's like to need help and not know where to turn," she said firmly. "You know what matters to people like you, people the system forgets. That's worth more than any business degree." She paused, then added, "And honestly, I could use someone around who sees me as a person, not just a CEO. Someone who tells me the truth." Daniel looked at Sophie, who'd glanced up from her drawings and was watching them with bright, curious eyes. He thought about what this could mean, not just the money or the opportunity, but the chance to actually make a difference for families like his, for kids like Sophie, who deserved better than scraping by. He thought about how scared Catherine had been in that bar, and how brave she'd been facing down that board meeting, and how maybe they both needed this in different ways. "Okay," he said finally, the word coming out steady and sure. "I'll help, on one condition." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Daniel smiled, a slow grin that made her smile back. "You come to our place for pancakes at least once a month. Sophie's going to ask, and I don't want to disappoint her." Catherine laughed, the sound bright and genuine, and reached out to shake his hand. "Deal," she said. And just like that, something new began. Something that felt like hope mixed with possibility, mixed with the start of a friendship neither of them had seen coming. The weeks that followed were busier than Daniel had ever been. Between his shifts at the garage and the meetings Catherine pulled him into, conference calls with lawyers and nonprofit experts, and people who actually knew what they were doing, Daniel felt out of his depth more often than not. But Catherine kept insisting his perspective mattered, kept asking what he thought, kept listening when he talked about the fear of getting evicted or the nightmare of choosing between fixing your car and buying groceries. Slowly, second chances took shape, and it felt real. It felt like something that might actually help people instead of just being another empty promise. Sophie adored Catherine, asked about her constantly, drew her pictures that Catherine actually hung up in her office. Mrs. Patterson, who never missed anything, started making pointed comments about nice young women and second chances that had nothing to do with nonprofits. Daniel tried to ignore the flutter in his chest every time Catherine showed up at his door, tried to tell himself this was just friendship, just mutual respect, nothing more complicated than that. But then she'd smile at him a certain way, or her hand would brush his when they were looking at paperwork together, and he'd feel that flutter turn into something bigger, something that scared him more than any photographer or board meeting ever could. 2 months after that night at the bar, Monroe Technologies held a press conference to announce second chances. Daniel stood off to the side of the stage, uncomfortable in the suit Catherine had insisted on buying him, watching as she addressed the crowd of reporters and cameras. She talked about the importance of supporting families, about second chances and human dignity, And then she did something he hadn't expected. She gestured for him to join her at the podium. Daniel's heart hammered as he walked out into the lights, hyper-aware of every eye on him. "This is Daniel Hayes," Catherine said, her voice strong and clear. "2 months ago, he helped me when I needed it most. He didn't have to. He didn't know who I was. He just saw another person in trouble and decided to do the right thing." She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. "Daniel taught me that real strength isn't about being perfect or powerful. It's about showing up for people, even when it's hard, even when there's nothing in it for you. He's the reason this fund exists. Because I want to live in the kind of world he's building for his daughter, a world where kindness matters more than status, where we take care of each other." The applause was overwhelming, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. But Daniel barely heard any of it. He was too busy looking at Catherine, seeing the gratitude and something else, something warm and complicated and terrifying, reflected back at him. When they finally escaped backstage, away from the noise and the lights, she turned to him with a shaky laugh. "Was that too much? I didn't mean to put you on the spot like that." Daniel shook his head, finding his voice. "No, it was perfect. You were perfect." They stood there in the narrow hallway, close enough that he could smell her perfume, could see the tiny freckles on her nose that makeup usually hid. "Daniel," she said softly, and his name in her mouth sounded like a question and an answer all at once. "I need to tell you something." He waited, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "These past 2 months, getting to know you and Sophie, working on this project together, it's been the best part of my day. Every day. And I keep telling myself it's just friendship, just gratitude. But I don't think that's true anymore." She took a shaky breath. "I think I'm falling for you. And I know that's complicated and maybe completely insane. But I needed you to know." Daniel felt the world tilt, then right itself in a way that made everything suddenly clear. "It's not insane," he said quietly. "I feel it too. Have been feeling it. Just didn't know what to do about it." Catherine's eyes went wide, hope and fear warring on her face. "Really?" Daniel reached out, cupping her face with his work-rough hands, careful and gentle. "Really? You're brilliant and brave, and you make Sophie laugh, and you see me as more than just a guy who fixes cars. How could I not fall for you?" And then he kissed her, soft and sweet, and full of all the things he didn't have words for yet. And she kissed him back, like he was precious, like he mattered, like this was the start of something neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, both smiling like idiots, Catherine rested her forehead against his. "So what now?" she asked. Daniel thought about his small apartment and her penthouse, about grease stains and boardrooms, about all the ways their lives didn't match. Then he thought about Sophie's laughter and Catherine's smile and the feeling of rightness that had settled in his chest. "Now we figure it out," he said simply. "Together. One day at a time." Catherine nodded, her hand finding his and lacing their fingers together. "I can do that," she whispered, "as long as there are pancakes involved." Daniel laughed, the sound bright and free, and pulled her close again. 6 months later, the Blue Corner hadn't changed a bit. Same old wood, same cheap whiskey, same bartender who'd seen it all and kept his mouth shut. But when Daniel walked in with Catherine and Sophie, people did double takes, whispers following them to a corner booth. Sophie, who'd insisted on coming because it was part of their story, bounced excitedly in her seat. "This is where it happened, right, Dad?" "Where you saved Catherine?" Daniel exchanged a glance with Catherine, both of them smiling at Sophie's dramatic retelling. "Something like that, kiddo." They ordered burgers and fries, Nothing fancy, just food and quiet conversation, and the comfortable ease that came from months of learning each other's rhythms. Catherine fit into his life now in ways that still surprised him sometimes, showing up at soccer games in jeans and a ponytail, teaching Sophie to paint on Sunday afternoons, falling asleep on his couch after long days at the office. She'd offered to get them a bigger place, somewhere between her world and his. But Daniel had said, not yet, wanting Sophie to have stability, wanting to build this right without rushing. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Daniel looked at her. At Sophie coloring on the paper placemats, at the bar where everything had started. "I'm thinking about how random life is," he said honestly. "How one choice, one moment of deciding to help instead of looking away, can change everything." Catherine squeezed his hand, her eyes soft. "Best decision you ever made?" she asked, teasing but also serious. Daniel pretended to consider, then grinned. "Second best. First was having Sophie." Sophie looked up at the sound of her name. "What about me?" she demanded. "I'm the best, right?" "You're definitely the best," Catherine agreed, reaching over to ruffle Sophie's hair. "You and your dad both." She looked at Daniel again, and there was love there, clear and uncomplicated, despite everything that was still complicated about their lives. "Thank you," she said quietly. The same words she'd said that first night, but meaning something different now, something deeper. For seeing me, for not giving up on me, for building this with me. Daniel brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles, not caring who was watching. "Thank you for letting me," he said simply. Sophie made a gagging noise at the display of affection, and they both laughed, the moment breaking into something lighter. They finished their meal, telling Sophie stories about her dad's heroic rescue that got more exaggerated with each telling, until even the bartender was grinning. When they finally left, stepping out into the cool evening air, Sophie ran ahead to the truck, her energy boundless. Catherine stopped Daniel with a hand on his arm, looking back at the bar. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "helping me that night?" Everything that came after. Daniel didn't even have to think about it. "Not for a second," he said firmly. "You're the best thing that's happened to me since Sophie." He paused, then added with a smile. "Even if you do insist on putting fancy coffee in my regular coffee maker." Catherine laughed, swatting his arm, and Daniel caught her hand, pulling her close. The street was quiet, just them and the distant sound of traffic and the soft glow of streetlights. "I love you," he said, the words still new enough to feel momentous, but familiar enough to feel true. "I love your strength and your vulnerability and the way you are with my daughter. I love that you see the world like I do, like it can be better if we just try." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but happy ones this time, the kind that came from being full instead of empty. "I love you too," she whispered. "You showed me what real strength looks like, what real kindness looks like. You gave me a second chance at being human instead of just successful. That's everything." They kissed there on the sidewalk outside a dive bar, two people from different worlds who'd found each other in the darkness and decided to build something in the light. Sophie honked the truck horn, making them break apart laughing, and they climbed in together, heading home to Daniel's small apartment that somehow held enough space for all three of them and the life they were building. The world kept spinning, complicated and messy and full of challenges. Monroe Technologies thrived under Catherine's leadership, but she worked saner hours now, made time for what mattered. Second Chances helped hundreds of families in its first year, with Daniel's input making it better and more effective than any consultant could have managed. Sophie started 4th grade with Catherine at her art show, and Daniel beaming from the audience. Mrs. Patterson became an unofficial grandmother, absolutely delighted with how things had turned out. The media moved on to other stories, other scandals, leaving Catherine and Daniel to just be themselves, together. And sometimes, late at night, when Sophie was asleep and they were curled up on Daniel's worn couch, Catherine would trace the calluses on his hands and marvel at how one choice, one moment of compassion, had led them here. "What if you hadn't helped me?" she'd ask, and Daniel would kiss her forehead and say, "But I did. And you let me. That's what matters." Because that's what it came down to in the end. Not the money, or the status, or the differences in their backgrounds, but the simple fact that when someone needed help, he'd stepped up, and when someone offered love, she'd been brave enough to accept it. The jacket hung in Daniel's closet now, that worn denim jacket he'd thrown around her shoulders in a moment of pure instinct. Catherine borrowed it sometimes, wearing it around the apartment on lazy Sundays, and every time Daniel saw her in it, he remembered that night. The fear in her eyes, and the trust she'd placed in a stranger. He remembered the choice he'd made, not because it was easy, or smart, or would lead to anything good, but simply because it was right. And that choice had given him this life, this love, this family that kept growing and changing and becoming more than he'd ever imagined possible. In the end, that's what the story was really about. Not rescue or romance or rags to riches fairy tales, but the quiet truth that kindness matters, that showing up for people matters, that building a world where compassion comes first matters more than anything else. Daniel had known that before Catherine, had been living it for Sophie's sake, but Catherine had shown him it worked both ways, that accepting help was just as important as giving it, that vulnerability was its own kind of strength. Together, they were proof that different worlds could meet and merge, that love could grow in unexpected places, that second chances were real if you were brave enough to take them. And if you'd asked Daniel, standing in that bar on that Friday night with a stranger's desperation in his ears and a choice to make, if he'd known where it would lead, he'd probably have done it anyway, because that's who he was, who his daughter needed him to be, who Catherine helped him see more clearly every day. A man who chose kindness over convenience, connection over comfort, love over fear. A man who took off his jacket and stepped between someone and the world that wanted to hurt them, and in doing so, found his own way home.